All right, Tess, about to go live.
Let's do it.
Here we go.
We have had some technical problems.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We're live. Hi, everybody on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. Welcome to Back to Basics from PTZOptics.
Test Protesto here.
I'm Paul Richards, and we come to you every Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, to give you tips on how to use live streaming cameras, specifically PTZOptics cameras.
We've got a great show prepared for you guys today, starting off with a couple quick announcements. You may or may not have heard the 2018 Streaming Awards are now in session. June 1st is the date of the Streaming Awards, but voting begins now, so head to streamingawards.com to cast your votes for your favorite live streamers. Today's going to be all about color correction, but we have a special announcement. Last week we spoke about OBS's new PTZ Control app. We recently released the Windows version. Right above me, you'll see that. But exciting news, there's now a Mac adaptation. So there's now a PTZ control for Macs that can be used with OBS. So make sure that you head to ptzoptics.com/apps to download that. Moving on to Paul.
So, as Tess mentioned, today's all about color correction. And we're going to show you how to use color corrections with Vectorscopes, Waveform monitors. But ideally, what we're going to show you how to do is to get the perfect best exposure with the PTZOptics camera. We got a couple tools we're going to show you guys how to use. One of them is a white balance feature, so you'll learn about that. We will show you how to use a color checker, but also a white balance gray card, which will allow you to do a one-push white balance. We will also talk a little bit about light settings, because lighting is important, and we're going to talk about lighting and the different kelvins there. We're going to talk about having a good monitor and calibrating that monitor and the tools that you can use to trust that your camera exposure is going to be the ideal exposure. And then that is it. So we'll talk about all that and more in the rest of this video. So we'll see you guys in just a moment.
PTZOptics presents Back to the Basics Live. Every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. A high-definition broadcast on Facebook, focusing on camera line tutorials with our Chief Streaming Officer, Paul Richards, and our social media manager, Tess Protesto. Back to the Basics Live. New videos every Wednesday.
All right, everybody, we have an amazing presentation to go over to you today. How to get the ideal exposure with your PTZOptics cameras.
Yeah, we recently just did it ourselves, and we feel like we've really begun to master the technique with our cameras, so I can't wait to share that with you.
Now, I want to start off by saying that it's not just a one-click process. It does take time. Companies actually, in movie theaters, actually hire a colorist to color grade the entire video, so it can be a full-time job for someone. If you are planning a shoot, plan ahead. If you're going out mobile, budget at least 30 to 45 minutes to do this process. If you're installing the cameras permanently, the good news is you may only need to do this once.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's the case with a lot of our cameras. Once we've got it down, we're ready to use it every time.
So we're going to go through this. A couple of the tools that you may need, we showed you guys earlier, the color checker. There is one available on Amazon for just $10. And then there are more expensive ones from X-Rite that are a little bit more sturdy and have some more features that we'll show you as well. These are more like $100. And then for $10, this is something I'm going to show you how to use today. A really cool white balance filter that really helps get your one-push white balance. A great place to start. And especially if time is an issue, this is a great way to get started quickly. We're going to talk about Vectorscopes, Waveform monitors. We're even going to show you how to color correct in Adobe Premiere briefly. And don't forget, if you're relying on your monitor and you don't have a Waveform monitor or Vectorscope, get a professional calibrated monitor that's going to give you an accurate color representation of the camera. So here's a couple of considerations that we talked about. I think we actually went through a lot of this, but in post-production, you can actually do some work. You can actually take a video clip from the camera and put it into Premiere and see what Premiere tells you as far as a waveform monitor or vector scope. And now vMix also is one of the first live streaming softwares for PC that has Vectorscopes and Waveform monitors. NewTek also has one with their NewTek Connect Pro app and their NewTek TriCaster. So look for those tools. You can use them if you don't have a reliable monitor. Now here's a little bit of our workflow test, and I actually have a video I want to show where we went to the Uptown, we were at the theater doing our test footage, and I just want to show a little clip. This will set the scene for our workflow, how we get started with getting the ideal exposure.
Here we go.
Okay, so we are now going to do the base level color correction inside the cameras before we look at color correction with a waveform monitor and a Vectorscope. So let me just show you what we're doing here. So we have IP control of all the cameras. So I'm kind of just getting them to a spot where they're all close. We've already color corrected the 12x. We've got the 20x. Now they're not perfect yet. We've got them as far as we can go in the camera, and then in the software we're going to take it further. And then what we do is we go ahead over to the OSD menu. The 30x still needs to be color corrected. And we come in here and remotely over the network, we go in and we set all the cameras to be the same exposure, or at least very close. So we're going in and opening up the iris, setting everything up so that they're all pretty much the same. And then we go in and white balance them. I mentioned earlier that we have a color checker card and a gray card. So we're going to zoom into those. We're going to run a one-push white balance and make sure all the cameras have a good exposure before we go into the color correction in the software. So as you can see in our workflow, obviously we set up the cameras, then we configure them, and configuration is, getting, and when we'll talk about configuration, we'll talk about this a little later in the presentation, but you may know that you're going to stream in 1080p 30 frames per second. That's part of your configuration, your resolution, your frame rate, and your frame rate may actually affect your shutter speed, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So to configure all the cameras, we'll give you tools to configure. Then you want to start with just a basic white balance, and ideally you want to put, we talked about this in the video, how you want to put your color corrector and your gray card or your white card for the color balance in the scene the way the lighting is in the space that you're going to be filming. Use your color checkers. Then we do some testing, and you can't really test unless you have a really great you can't test with your own eyes. And in fact, women have better eyes than men. They have more color cones in their eyes.
Especially in your case, Paul.
So yeah, I'm colorblind. So you have to use a waveform monitor or a Vectorscope if you're like me. 10% of men are colorblind. And overall,
it is always men from what I've seen.
Only 1% of women are colorblind, and women in general have better receptors in their eyes.
Fun fact I learned yesterday, also about men and women. 65% of women are receiving dental care in the United States over men.
Oh
Not
my
because
gosh.
they have more issues, but because men are afraid.
Yes, don't even get me started. I'm totally afraid to be going to the dentist this afternoon. Next, that's our workflow. Tess is using our telestrator here. So just to step you through it.
Aren't the arrows good?
The arrows are great.
Yeah.
Good job with the arrows.
They make it a little bit easier.
I think it definitely directs the attention properly. And we're showing this little color checker here. I'm going to show you how to use this in just a second. I think it'd be a good test. But you can set up your lighting. So if you're setting up lighting, you might want a blue, you might want a red. Theaters have hundreds of different color options that they use. Get your lighting set, because that is going to affect what the cameras can do. Then consider the basic setups. Do you want your shutter speed to be a certain quickness because you want to really have a high shutter speed for sports? Or do you want to have your aperture really open because you want to have, that kind of artistic look?
Right. You can think about some artistic elements, but also, just if it's a really dark room or a very light room, or what time of day it's going to be as well for your event.
Yeah, so shutter speed, aperture, and gain are really the first ones we're going to look at, and we'll do more about that in the next slide. Then we want to do our white balance, and again, we can use this tool here, which I'm going to show you really quickly how to use. Why don't we just show that really quickly on the main cam? I think this is going to be a cool little tutorial on how to. This is if you're in a pinch and you want to get your white balance set properly right away. What you can do is you can use this. You can pop it right in front of the camera, and then you hit. I'm going to show you this on the remote control here. Let's see if it. Oh, take it away. There we go. On the menu button here, we want to hit the menu button, And I'll do that right now. Menu. Oh, make sure I get control of this camera. There we go. Little live testing. Hit menu, color, and then we can actually do what's called a one push. And we can go up to the camera. Just give it a little space. Hit one push. And it will actually calculate the white balance based off of that. And you can see it looks really nice. So just a little quick test there. These things save a lot of time in white balancing, so you may enjoy that. Let's get back to our presentation. We'll do a little live demonstration.
All right.
So once you've got your white balance set up, you may want to use a gray card like this. You would zoom all the way into the gray card and run a white balance on this.
Whoops.
Or you can actually bring this into
like
a waveform monitor and check. Now this again, we'll look at this later, but this here is a black and gray scales. And you can look at that in a waveform monitor. We'll show it a little bit later today. And you can actually see if your camera is accurately representing the gray scales, so we can get our blacks and our whites perfect. Then we would just look at the color checker, and we can use the Vectorscope to check on colors. And when we're doing that, we might want to adjust the hue, the red and blue gain, and the contrast to get those colors right.
You mentioned that our light just went out, and that's why you just saw a difference.
Yeah, our light just went out.
We have a funky light that likes to turn off, never on, on its own time. So every once in a while, there we go. And then there was light.
That's why you saw a little light drop there. Okay, so that's our setup process. Now, the main settings, like I mentioned, is shutter speed, gain, and aperture. And once you get those tuned in, on the next slide, you'll see that there's a whole bunch more. But we want to get the proper frame rate, shutter speed, and aperture in your camera. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we can go on to the more advanced settings.
The colors and whatnot.
Yeah, which I think is on the next slide. Sorry about that. Which include luminance, saturation, white balance, color balance, sharpness, gamma, 2D and 3D noise reduction, and aperture. Now, we're not going to have time today to go into all of these, but this whole presentation and this whole guide is available at PTZOptics.com/downloads. It's called the Camera Settings Guide. So we're not going to there's some things we're going to breeze over, but it's all explained in this guide. There's wide dynamic range, for example, and things like that. So one of the things I want to stress is that if you are live streaming and doing live video, there is no post-production. So don't skip this process.
Yeah.
There's no going back once you've streamed it out live. This is an interesting way to think about it. So if you're in low light, if you're in a theater, if you're in a artistic performance, you want to be looking at shutter speed and gain. If you're in a production studio, you probably have really great lighting. So you're more looking at the aperture and trying to get that dialed in, because that can give you a really great depth of field. If you're in a conference space, again, you probably have pretty good lighting. You may have to deal with a little shutter speed and aperture. And then on live sports, we have up here on the shutter speed side, because we're looking at motion control, really high shutter speed, really high frame rates. And we'll talk about some rules of thumb for you there as well. So here is the levels of complexity. So in a production studio, in a conference space, these are like installed areas where the cameras are set, you tune them in, like where we are now. It's easy to really get it right, because you do it once and you get it right. But when you're setting up for a live sporting event where there's a lot of action or there's low light, it gets a little bit more complex. And we're going to give you the tools to do an easy system or a more complex scene. We're not going to go into every exposure setting right now, but this is all available in the guide. Again, we're not going to go over everything in aperture, but aperture is also known as an f-stop. It's how much the iris opens, and there's a whole lot of tips in here for how to get really great depth of field using the aperture setting. Shutter speed is we talked about that a little bit. It basically it supplies the amount of time it takes for the shutter to open and close on each frame. So if it's really fast, it'll capture movement. If it's really slow, it'll look blurred. So a good rule of thumb is if you're streaming at a frame rate of, let's say, 1080p at 60 frames per second, you double that and you would do a shutter speed of like 1 by 120 seconds. That kind of makes it that smooth, natural feel. And
the longer the shutters open, the more light it lets in.
Yes.
So it might be overexposed as well.
It could, and that's where you would have to balance the aperture, because the aperture is how much the iris is open.
Yeah.
So just it's all a balancing act, but these are tools that you can use to get the ideal exposure. And then color balance, we're going to talk a lot about that today, so we'll just kind of run through it really quickly. And then contrast is really important, and again, this whole guide is going to be available online. Noise reduction is really important for low light. So the lower light you have, the more noise that you may find. And the PTZOptics cameras have 3 different options, a 2D and a 3D noise reduction, and then a hot pixel reduction. This guide will explain when and where to use those. Now we're going to talk a little bit about a waveform monitor, and Michael has a little footage we're going to show, and we're going to talk a little bit about what this does. So, Michael, do you want to show it in Adobe Premiere first or in vMix?
Adobe.
All right, so we're going to look at this in Adobe Premiere. A lot of you may be familiar with Adobe Premiere. It's one of the biggest video editing platforms. And the waveform monitor is actually the counterpart to the Vectorscope. So this is, Vectorscope is really used to represent color in an image. And it's an X and Y graph representation of the color accuracy from your video feed. Now in Premiere, we're actually recording a video clip, and then importing it into Premiere. But vMix can actually do live video feeds. And at the top of the Vectorscope, you often have red, and toward the bottom, you have your cyan, green, and other colors. And it's similar to what you'll see in most color correction softwares. It's a graph that shows the balance of the colors coming in from your video.
It's wild.
It also allows you to color correct based on this. So ideally what we're doing here is we are looking at the colors from the camera once we've gotten it absolutely as good as we can, and then we will do enhancements in the software.
So with this, you're comparing it to what it looks like in real life based what it's looking like through the camera lens.
Yeah.
Okay.
So real life is this. Camera tries to represent it as great as possible, and then the software goes and says, all right, well, digitally it should be this, and that's where we can do some tweaking. So that's the waveform monitor, and then there is a Vectorscope as well. And I got one more clip I want to show from the 2018 NAB show right here, where we're talking about it with Martin Sinclair. And he's showing us that the vMix color charts produce a line that connects your current image to the ideal colors. So you can see there that you can see if the colors are clipping at all. So if they're clipping, you really don't want your camera to be clipping. There should be space, a little bit of black space on the bottom and top. If the camera's clipping, this is one of the things that I would give you advice on. One of the key things with color correction is that most people try to color correct and do all the exposure inside the camera, but many times the highlights can be blown out even before they get to the video production software. So using the Vectorscope and the waveform monitor, you can bring down the range of your camera to make sure that you're not clipping before it gets to the software. So these tools make sure you're not crushing the blacks or overexposing the whites with the settings in your camera. And the waveform monitor specifically allows users to stretch the exposure to the perfect white and black settings. So the color correction tools, you'll see 3 wheels commonly used in video editing software. The first wheel represents blacks, which are the shadows, often known as lift. Gain is also known as gamma, which is the midtones. And then the third wheel represents the highlights and the overall brightness of the image. Each wheel adjusts a particular part of the video image. So the first wheel is the dark areas, the middle wheel would be the skin tones, and the final wheel would be the highlights and the brightness. So using these 3 components of the color correction wheels, it allows operators the ability to do fine color correction in an intuitive layout. You can use the gain control, for example, to adjust the yellows just in the highlights of the image. A lot of cameras have a little bit of yellow in the highlights that we can now remove. The tool is similar to a lot of the other correction tools out there today, and it's just really great to do that at the very end. Once you've done everything we've talked about, at the very end, you might want to just boost the midtones just a little bit. You might want to just make the blacks just a little crisper. So that's what I found in the lift. Just maybe just take a little bit of the black stretch and just stretch those blacks a little bit, and then boost the midtones just a little bit. Really
exciting to see that new feature in vMix.
It's so cool. And today we're talking about exposure. Next week, we're going to talk about color matching,
Mm-hmm.
and that is where we actually like apply a color grade to multiple cameras. So today we're not going to dig too much further into this, except for the fact that we've gotten a really great exposure with these tools. There's the Vectorscope there, which shows a map of the colors as well. We talked about that already. So some of the advice, you know, I just actually read all the advice, so we're good there. But set that color corrector up and get these live cameras up and running. In conferencing spaces, a lot of times we're seeing 1080p at 30 frames a second. The camera aperture and shutter speed, everything's set to automatic because throughout the day the lighting might change a little bit. Now, in a production facility, you know, you might go up to 60 frames a second. I beg to differ and say that you really only need 1080p 30, really.
Sorry about that. This is tough. I
And
meant to highlight this. There we
the
go.
production. But you may actually want a small aperture to get that crisp details.
See if I can get the resolution right. Oh, yeah.
Nice. And then you would have the shutter speed probably automatic. The focus you might set on manual, and you can have manual focus per preset. You may be controlling it with a remote or a joystick, or maybe even the software applications that we just came out with. And then you may be touching up the hue and the contrast for a perfect chroma key. Now, in live sports, we're seeing a lot more at the 60 frames a second, and we're seeing those large 1.8 apertures. We have fast shutter speeds, you know, using our rule of thumb, maybe 1/120. We got that manual focus, you know, set all the way to infinity. And a lot of people are using a joystick to move around really quickly. There's low light. In low light, we're going to have small aperture openings and a slower shutter speed. You're going to have to play around with that. That's where things get more complicated. And we got a streaming checklist you can check out as well at PTZOptics.com/landing/checklist. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Tess is going to do the trivia today because she was joking around by saying that, yes, I do have to go to the dentist. So you got some trivia to play with the guys?
Yes, we will play some trivia. We're going to head over to Twitch, twitch.tv/sgeeks. Again, twitch.tv/sgeeks to play trivia. I'll see you guys over there.
All right. We'll see you guys soon. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. Hopefully we've helped you get the perfect camera exposure.
And good luck at the dentist.
Thank you.